So much for coming along today. Before I get stuck into my content, I want to say a huge thank you to the organizers of this event. It takes an unbelievable amount of work to pull something like this together. So can we give just a massive round of applause to the event organizers for making all this possible? So I have, over the past 5 years of my life, had some crazy adventures. And I've been in the very fortunate position to be able to have traveled the world exploring the very big lives of the people who have chosen to live in small homes. So today, just to kick things off, I want to talk to you about some of the people that I've met along the way and some of the insights that I've learned as to why people all over the globe are choosing to live in smaller homes. But before I do that, I thought it'd be good just to give a little bit of background about me, why I chose to live in a tiny house on wheels. And I think that my story will probably resonate with a lot of people who live in Vancouver and the surrounding Vancouver areas, because we both live in incredibly expensive parts of the world. So before my YouTube life, was an actor and a musician. So I used to do acting jobs for a living. I used to do television commercials. I was on a television soap opera for a while. And when I wasn't working doing acting jobs, I was a wedding singer. And I don't know if any of you have ever had creative jobs. Working in creative fields, arts, film, that sort of thing. What about people who have started businesses? Have you ever tried starting a business? There's a lot of us who work in professions that we're passionate about, wanting to do things in the world that inspire us, that inspire other people, and that give us a reason to get out of bed in the morning. But we're not always really well paid for those positions, are we? Those jobs, those sort of positions in society don't always come with regular paychecks. Virtually my whole life, I have never known what it was like to have a stable weekly income. Couple that with the fact that I live in an incredibly expensive city. So I'm pretty sure my stats are still up to date. Vancouver is the world's third most unaffordable city to live in, right? So that's on the Housing Affordability Index where it's all ranked. So I'm pretty sure right now it goes Hong Kong, Sydney, Vancouver, and then Auckland City, where I live, right? So it's really hard to live in a city with such unaffordable real estate. And this shows how much. So September 2018, average house price in my city was $917,000, almost $1 million. And that's actually after the statistics had somewhat come down from 2017. Average salary, $74,000 a year, right? That means that the average house price was about 12 times the average income in the city. In the last 10 years, house prices in the city have risen by over 70%. We had some suburbs in Auckland where the average house price was raising by $1,000 a day. Has anyone here ever had a paycheck rise like that? Show off. So right now, I'm in my mid-30s, and people in my generation and younger in New Zealand, we're referred to as Generation Rent. We're called Generation Rent because they don't expect us to ever be able to own our own homes unless we have family assistance, we win the lotto, or some major change occurs within the housing market. Puts us into a really difficult situation. So, what do you do when you're in that situation? What do you do when you're in a city that you love, doing something that you love, but that you don't always get paid for, and you've been completely priced out of the housing market? Well, the way I see it, there are two options. You either get depressed or you get creative. So I have a background in permaculture, and through permaculture, I developed a love for earth building. Beautiful, simple, earthen homes, things that can be made with resources that are right there in front of us, and where the biggest expense of construction is human labor. I was an unemployed actor. I had plenty of time to put into labor. And so I started looking at the process of building an earth home. But there was a big problem with building an earthen home. Can anyone guess what that might be? The land, right? When you're looking at building a home in a city like Auckland, the land is actually the most expensive part of the equation. So, again, you can either get depressed or you can get creative. Now, there's lots of options around finding land share agreements. There are lots of things like communities and places where you can find resources like land for building a home. But while I was researching all of this, one day I went online and I found this picture. You guys know who this is, right? This is a picture of Jay Schaefer. So Jay Schaefer is, I guess, someone who is considered to be the godfather of the modern tiny house movement. And when I saw this picture, it completely blew my mind. Why? The home on wheels. The concept of being able to actually own my own home and having the home transportable so that I didn't need to own the land that it sat on. That to me was a complete game changer. And so I started designing my own tiny house on wheels. I started looking at what was happening in America and trying to figure out how I could somehow replicate this in New Zealand, how I could build to my local legal sort of structures, which are very, very different because we do not have roads like you do in North America. So I started the process of designing and building my own tiny house on wheels. And while I was doing that, I decided to start the YouTube channel. And I did that because I looked around and I could see so many people who were in exactly the same situation that I was. So many people who were struggling to get ahead. Even the friends of mine who were able to buy homes were now riddled with so much debt that their quality of life was almost non-existent. And so I got really excited about not just doing this for myself, but sharing it with other people, letting people know that this was a possibility, that it was out there. And when I started sharing videos of my own story, that is when I started getting contacted by people who said, "Hey, Bryce, it's really cool what you're doing, but why don't you come check out my house?" And the rest is history. We started the Living Big in a Tiny House YouTube channel, and we started doing the video tours, and that was when things really started taking off. And this has been completely unexpected and an absolutely beautiful turn of events in my life. It blows my mind that our show has now had over 200 million views all over the world. And I think, thank you. And I think that just stands as a testament to how relevant this really is for all of us right now. So I was building my tiny house and I was growing my YouTube channel. But life happens, right? And even a tiny house on wheels is somehow something which can be a relatively expensive process. Now, I made a lot of mistakes in the way that I constructed this house, and there were things that I could have done to bring down the cost and everything, but somewhere in the back of my mind when I was building this home, I thought to myself that it was likely that it would be the only home that I would ever own in my life. So I wanted to do it really right, and I wanted to choose really good materials and high-quality craftsmen and all this sort of thing, which meant it was really expensive. So I ran out of money. I had a relationship breakup, and I kind of hit a little bit of a low point in my life. And that was when I realized as well that I was once again in a very similar situation. And I could either get depressed or I could get creative. And so I moved into a tent. I say I live in a tent and it makes me sound really homeless, but it was a very beautiful tent, kind of a cross between a bell tent and a yurt. And I had a wood stove in it and a beautiful bed and a little kitchenette that I had refashioned from an old sideboard. And it was a really fun project. And this taught me something as well about the need and necessity for intermediary housing options, right? Because sometimes, well, for many of us, or some people, going into a tiny house is a relatively easy step. But there are others out there for whom even the money that's required for a tiny house is really hard to obtain, right? Auckland City right now, average house price for just a one-bedroom close to city limits, you're talking $500 a week, right? Most Aucklanders are spending half of their weekly income after tax just on their accommodation. So if you're in a city where you're having to put out that much money, that much of your paycheck every week just to live, the idea of then saving up for a tiny house on wheels even can feel really far out of the reach. And so this is why this was such a powerful option to me. It gave me an opportunity to regroup, to save some money, and to continue my tiny house journey. It also taught me a lot about small space living. I think when I was starting to get into the idea of tiny houses, I had idealized a lot of things in my mind. And I had this very sort of idyllic picture of what my home would be like. I had this idea that I wanted a wood stove only. I didn't want anything else for cooking. I wanted to be able to cook each and every meal on a beautiful fire that I would light each day. I wanted an outdoor toilet so that every morning I would be able to, or when I wanted to use the bathroom at night, I would be able to step outside and I would be able to look up into the infinite galaxy and the stars above at 3 a.m. and contemplate life, the universe, and everything. But it wasn't until when it was 5 o'clock in the morning and I had some place to be and I was outside trying to rustle around for firewood to get my stove started that I thought maybe it would be a nice idea just to have a gas hob in there. It wasn't until one especially rainy, stormy night where I was trying to figure out how to pee through a hole in my canvas tent that I realized maybe I should just put a bathroom in the house. So living like this was a wonderful experience. It taught me a lot about who I was. It taught me a lot about what was important to me. And it taught me a lot about small space design. It taught me a lot about how we can really get to know ourselves, the true version of ourselves, so that we can design homes that work for us. And that is what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. And then I met this one. This is Rasa. She is the absolute powerhouse behind Living Big, doing a lot of the camera work, a lot of the editing work. And I tell you folks, when you meet a girl who is excited that you live in a tent, that's how you know you found the one, right? And the show continued to grow. And surprisingly, we actually developed a really phenomenal audience here in North America, which is really exciting. And we ended up spending so much time in North America that we decided to build a tiny house on wheels here. So the cool thing about this is, even though today I'm going to be sort of blitzing past some of the homes and blitzing past some of the designs, if you want to double down on any of this information or find anything more out about any of these homes, you can jump onto the Living Big in a Tiny House YouTube channel, and there are full tours packed with information. So even though I'm blitzing over it today, you'll definitely be able to dive deeper on all of these topics if you choose to. But this here was a home which I designed to be super small, super compact, easy to travel with, easy to move. And we needed a vehicle to tow it. So we ended up finding this ambulance here, which was being retired by an ambulance department in Missouri. And it's the perfect tow vehicle for us. So Russ and I have actually been traveling all over the United States. I think we've gone through 39 states so far, which is super exciting. And we're now here exploring Canada. Unfortunately, we're not here with our tiny house this time around, but hopefully next year we'll be able to pull that off so that it's here for you to look at. I tell you what, if you're looking for a conversation starter at a gas station, that'll do it. And finally, I'm so happy to say that this summer I completed my tiny house on wheels in New Zealand, completed the home base, and that is just such a wonderful feeling for me now. But more on that later. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about what a tiny house is. Now, I guess in general, my tiny house, my definition of a tiny house is really open. When I think of a small space or a tiny house, I'm really talking about any kind of affordable, downsized architecture, forms of alternative living. So we've featured on the show shipping container homes, we've featured tree houses, we've featured boats, caravans, house trucks, all that sort of thing. There's a very, very wide variety of things that I consider to be tiny houses on wheels. Tiny houses. But I guess when I'm really talking about the quintessential tiny house, what I'm talking about are these homes on wheels. And the reason that these are so interesting to me is because of their portability, because they're designed to be moved. They're designed for people who don't own land, which I think is the real game changer. I get asked all the time by media and people that I'm talking to if I think tiny houses are a fad. And the mainstream really likes to characterize them like that. They love to talk about it like it's some fringe thing, like it's something that's right in this little niche category all of its own, right? That somehow it's just going to go away one day when people realize that small space living is a bit silly. But what I always think about is this, that for the vast majority of humans' existence on the earth, we have lived in small, simple shelter. Things that were easily obtainable, that we could construct ourselves. And also, along those lines, I think it would be really easy to argue that when you look at the history of humans' existence on the earth, one day it's likely that we're going to look back at the large house movement as being the temporary fad. This moment in time that we got carried away with greed and excessive consumption, when we stopped doing what was simple, affordable, and when we forgot what really worked for human beings. So who around the world is going tiny? That's it. So I can't express to you how in love I have fallen with the tiny house movement and its people. Doing the job that I get to do, I have met some of the most beautiful individuals, and I feel like in the tiny house movement, I found my tribe. I found my people. I found people who are solution-based, people who are trying to do things that are positive in the world and making a wonderful impact on those around them. And these people come from all walks of life. A lot of people think of the tiny house dwellers as people who are maybe just getting started out, right? Like it's a good thing for young people for the first home. But that's true. We've seen that. We've seen lots of cases of young people choosing tiny house living as their first home, as a step on the ladder to get into home ownership. Something that's initially doable, that allows them to save money on rent. That money that they save on rent can maybe then one day be put onto land, and then they can move their tiny house onto their own land and maybe one day build a larger home. It's pretty cool, right? We also see families living in tiny houses. We see people who are retiring in tiny houses. There's a lot of baby boomers who are now looking at tiny house and small space living, especially in cities like Auckland, where I'm from, or Vancouver, where so many of the baby boomer generations have all of their capital tied up in their homes. And with all the capital tied up in their homes and the expense of that, they're not looking forward to any quality of retirement until they downsize. So one of the things that's really interesting to me is the huge variety of reasons why people are going tiny. And this is something that I want to explore with you now. Economic is huge. Undeniably, it is a huge reason why a lot of people are going tiny. And it makes economic sense, right? I mean, we've been over the fact that it allows you to own a home without having to own the land. But it's not just about the initial purchase price. It's not just about the initial ticket price of the house, right? It's about everything that comes after that. You're living in a small space which doesn't consume a fraction of the resources. So all of a sudden, utility bills drop. Even things like mindset change. When you're living in a tiny house, your consumer habits inevitably are going to swap. All of a sudden, without all of this empty space to fill, you become hyper aware of everything that you bring into it. So minimalism is something that I think is something which naturally kind of springs from this. This is, again, Jay Schaefer. We did a video quite recently with Jay where we showed his new tiny house on wheels. And he really opened up to us about his personal story, where for a lot of his life, he has struggled with homelessness. He talked about being on the Oprah show the same day that he was going through a trash can trying to find dinner. And I think that it really goes to show how people from all walks of life, beautiful, intelligent, resourceful individuals, can find themselves in really unfortunate situations. And this is Jay's new home, which he has just built for himself, that's very simple, very stripped back. And in Jay's way as well, he's not only creating this for himself, but this is something that he's trying to make available to everyone. So he designed a house which can be very simply DIY constructed, with minimal instruction, and where the entire material resource cost is only $5,000. So he's really trying to look at pushing the boundaries of affordability. And part of that model is also looking at community. We've talked a lot today about community. There's a lot of conversation that's going on about this. And I think community is very much a cornerstone of the tiny house movement. So whereas so many of us are asking, how do we make our homes bigger and bigger, and how do we have more and more, Jay's thought process is all about how do we make things smaller, how do we aspire to less and less, and how do we need less and less to make things achievable. Right down to the point where he says, well, I'm not cooking all the time, so I don't need a kitchen all the time, so maybe that's something that could be a shared resource. He says, I'm not in the shower all the time, so maybe the shower can be a shared resource too. And while for many of us, myself included, that's potentially a little too minimal and not necessarily something that I would really want, I love his thought process in that and the way that he's always pushing the boundaries about what we really need and how we can think about paring down our life. This is Jesse. Jesse lives in Australia. He's just outside of Melbourne, which is, again, a very expensive Australian city. And this is an example of how, with a little bit of know-how and a lot of resourcefulness, you can really affordably construct a tiny house on wheels. Now, I get asked all the time about the cost of tiny homes, right? When you're looking at a lot of these very, very beautiful builder-model homes, there can be a little bit of sticker shock sometimes, right? But there is a tremendous amount that goes into them. So when you hear about a price tag of $100,000 or $150,000, you have to think about all of the appliances that are in that. You have to think about all of the materials that are in that. You have to think about all of these aspects that actually go into it. And because size is one of the cheapest things to add to a home, right? Inside a tiny house, in each of these, there's still a toilet, there's still a shower, there's still all of the things that you find in regular homes. So they can get pretty expensive, but we can also make them really affordable if we're willing to do the labor ourselves and if we're willing to be a little bit thrifty with material resourcing. And that's exactly what Jesse did. So Jesse constructed his home as a DIY build project, searching through Gumtree, which is kind of like your Craigslist here. He found all of the materials. All of the cladding on his house, for example, is old fence palings. He found secondhand windows, and he built this incredibly beautiful home for himself for under 20,000 Australian dollars, which is probably about the same as 20,000 Canadian. I think the values are pretty even at the moment. This is a big one, right? It's getting really relevant. When I talk about this in America, it depends on which state I'm talking as to whether or not global warming's a thing. But honestly, regardless of which side of the fence you're on, we have one home. We all live in this biosphere, and whether or not it's getting hotter, you don't have to stick your head out of the sand for too long to see that we're doing some real damage. I grew up in New Zealand, which is a place, we've got a great marketing department, and people think that we're a clean, green country. We're clean and green because we've got lots of farmland, and that farmland is desertifying our environment. We're, right now, 90% of our freshwater rivers are too polluted to swim in, right? These are rivers where I grew up in as a kid, which I could swim in, which if I have kids one day, they won't be able to. And I think that's a really heartbreaking thing. So regardless of where you sit on the fence about climate change or global warming, I think we can all agree that this is our first home, right? The body that we live in. That's important to take care of that. The second home is our planet, the biosphere, that which sustains us and the ecosystem that we, whether or not we see it, are an intimate part of. And the home that we build for ourselves, the tiny house on wheels, that's maybe our third home. So there's a lot of people who are choosing to go tiny for environmental reasons. Less consumption. Maybe looking at the fact that it's easier to go off the grid or use renewable energy resources because we're consuming so many less resources. This is a great example of a tiny house. This was built by Murray and Vicky also in Melbourne area. And they're permaculturalists. And this tiny house is part of the accommodation on a permaculture farm. So they live there together with their young daughter. This home was almost entirely constructed out of garbage that was found at the tip just down the road, showing the tremendous amount of resource and waste that we're throwing away. The home was entirely done, including all of its off-grid setup, for less than $10,000. So I think it really goes to show, again, just how we can think about reuse in the homes that we're building. Paul and Annette are another really inspiring couple. They live just outside of Byron Bay. And they were really sick of being stuck in Australia's fossil fuel economy. And they wanted to really experiment with getting out and seeing how easy it was going to be to get off the grid in their tiny house. And so they completely spec'd up their tiny house. They have great battery storage, all solar power. They're utilizing solar water heating. They're even creating their own home biogas from their kitchen scraps, which is super exciting. And when we're looking at use of renewable energy technologies, when we're thinking about it for conventional housing, it can be something which is super expensive, super prohibitive. But as soon as we're talking about that for tiny houses, it changes, right? Because all of a sudden, our consumption is so much less. My tiny house in New Zealand, which provides us with ample energy, is done so with only 4 300-watt solar panels and 2 240 amp hour batteries. That's it. Providing all the energy that I need for day-to-day living, which is pretty remarkable, I think. The entire system maybe cost me $5,000, right? And to never have another utility bill, that's a pretty good investment. Aside from economics and environment, and yet at the same time intimately connected with those two, is the lifestyle benefits of going tiny. A lot of people are driven to tiny house living because of the quality of life. I was somebody who naturally really resonated with small space living because I traveled a lot. I traveled a lot for work, and I traveled a lot for leisure. And so because of that, I was never somebody that had an opportunity to sort of acquire a lot of things. So I sort of quite naturally fell into minimalist living, and so in many ways it was kind of like a little bit of a wheel, because minimalist living and the fact that I didn't have a lot of expenses, the fact that I didn't have a lot of overheads, all of these things were what was also facilitating my ability to travel more. So there are definite lifestyle benefits to this. If you didn't have to pay rent, what would you do? If you think about that mortgage payment, what would you do with your life if you didn't have that hanging over your head anymore? How many of you would quit your jobs and do something else? You hear me? So when I think of tiny houses, I called the show Living Big in a Tiny House and Not Suffering Quietly in a Small Space, because this was really something that I wanted to explore. I wanted to explore what would happen if we gave people a little bit more freedom. I wonder if there are people out there who were remarkable, intelligent, creative, who never had the ability to really pursue their dreams or do the remarkable things in the world that they were destined for because they were just too burdened with debt, too burdened with living out this social contract that none of us signed. I love that. Have you guys ever been told that? Has anyone ever said to you, you got to live in the real world? You ever heard that? Yeah, right? The interesting thing to me about that saying is that when people say you just have to live in the real world, what are they talking about? You just have to get a job. Just have to pay taxes. That's the real world, right? That's not the real world. That's a social contract. It's one that we were born into. It's one that none of us signed, and it's one that serves very few of us. The real world is a place where organic food grows on trees, where fresh water falls from the sky, and where the earth provided each and every one of us with everything that we needed to live and be happy. The rest is a social contract. Christian and Alexis, Tiny House Expedition. You guys follow these guys on YouTube? They're super fun. I think right now they are the world's most traveled tiny house on wheels. They threw in their day jobs, built themselves a tiny house on wheels, and they've been traveling ever since. Last time we caught up with them, they'd traveled over 50,000 miles in their tiny home, which is pretty exciting. And for them, moving into the tiny house was what facilitated it. Wherever they go, they have a place to call home. And by paring down all of their expenses, they were able to channel the resources that they had into creating a lifestyle that they wanted. This is Johnny. Johnny is a van lifer from New Zealand. He also works as an electrician. So he decided to throw in the expensive Auckland City rent, and he built himself a beautiful converted Ford Transit van. As an electrician, he created a network of electrical companies all over New Zealand that he's able to work for, right? And every week, at the beginning of the week, he checks the surf report and he figures out where it's going to be best. And he calls up that electrical company, goes, right, I'm contracting for you this week. He drives there, surfs in the morning, works during the day, surfs at night, and this is how he lives now. Living a phenomenal lifestyle, all while saving all of that money, working a full-time job, saving all of that money that would otherwise just be thrown away, effectively paying off somebody else's mortgage or paying for somebody else's lifestyle, which is what rent does. And then Jenna, who gave up a wonderful position in the film industry, she also has her own YouTube channel. It's called Tiny House Giant Journey, and she lives in a tiny house, moved into a tiny house so that she could travel, which is her true passion. So she's on a mission at the moment. Each and every year, she is dedicated to visiting at least 5 different new countries. So she's another exciting lifestyler to check out. So I guess right off the bat, there were stories that I kind of expected, right? From all of this, I expected that we would hear about how there was, wonderful lifestyle stuff and people could travel more and debt-free living and all this kind of stuff. But there were stories that I didn't really expect, not right off the bat. And this is one of them. When we're talking about small space design, and again, this is something I'm diving into a lot more tomorrow, we have an opportunity to design spaces specifically for us. And one of the really remarkable things about that is the way that these tiny houses are making custom homes affordable for people, which change their lives. This is Merle. Merle is in her 80s, and this was one of my all-time favorite stories from the show. Her daughter built her this tiny house. At the time, she was struggling to do basic things for herself, but desperately trying to hold on to her self-reliance. She was in a situation where she had cleaners that were going to be coming into the home, and she would fluster herself trying to clean the house before the cleaners got there because she didn't want the cleaners to see the house as messy, but she wasn't able to do it anymore for herself, right? Growing old, it's hard, and losing some of the things that we could do before is really hard. But good design can help tremendously in that process. So her daughter sat down with her, looked at her life, looked at what she was doing, looked at what she was struggling with, and looked at all of the little design elements that she could put into the home that would give her back a quality of life. So really good insulation, making sure the home was always warm, underfloor heating so that when she got up at night, she didn't have a cold floor. She looked at mobility things, making sure that the home was accessible via wheelchair so that if she turned sick, that was an option. Making sure that her walker would fit so that she could get herself everywhere in the home. Making sure that she had reinforced the walls in the right places so that where handrails needed to be installed, she could do that. And now, at 85 years old, Merle is once again comfortable living alone in her own space, which I think is really beautiful. And there's a flip side to that. Anyone else riddled with the affliction of being a little bit tall? I'm 6'4", which is, I think, just on the border of potentially becoming freakish. And I think at that height already, I'm starting to see that the world just wasn't fit for me. I've got a cousin who's 7'2", I have an uncle who's 6'8", so I'm not quite at the stage where I have to bend down to get under a doorway, but I know people who are. But even just at my height, I know that doing dishes sucks, right? Because if your bench is down here, you're washing dishes down there, and it's unpleasant. So this is Dylan and Julie. Dylan and Julie live here in BC. They're actually over on Vancouver Island. And in their tiny house, both of them are tall, both of them stand at over 6 foot, and they specifically designed everything in the tiny house to be their height. So higher bench tops, higher sinks, higher everything, which enables them to actually fit into the space. And this was something super cool, right? That even if you're a really big dude like me, you can design a tiny house that feels more comfortable than a big one, which I think is really neat. Work benefits, right? Now, I guess obviously we see work benefits from things like the digital nomad movement, which is huge. So we're seeing lots of people and changing trends in the work environment where more and more of us are able to work remotely. We're able to work from home. And if you can work from home, why would you choose to do it in a super expensive city where the cost of living prevents you from actually being able to enjoy your paycheck? So as the digital nomad movement grows, we're starting to see, or as the work from home movement grows, we're starting to see more and more people deciding to change locations, to swap it up, to go to cheaper places, to build tiny houses on wheels or vans and actually travel and see the world and live life while they're working, which is super cool. This is Gabrielle, and her story is especially interesting to me. We visited her at the Gibbon Conservation Research Center, which is in Santa Clarita, just outside of California. And she is a biologist who is studying vocalization habits, like the songs of gibbons. Really beautiful, beautiful work that she's doing while she's running this conservation center. And she is so immersed in her job, and she has so much love for these animals. She wants to be around them all the time. And so she bought this tiny house on wheels, and she parked it smack bam in the middle of the Conservation Research Center. We would be having cups of tea, looking out her windows, and seeing gibbons swinging in their cages. It was absolutely remarkable. So living in the tiny house on wheels for her, it allowed her to completely immerse herself in the work that she loves doing. And it enabled her to be there for her animals, so that if one of her animals falls sick and needs attention at 3 a.m., she's right there to help them, which I think is pretty remarkable. Then we met Rumi and Katrina. Rumi and Katrina have a business called Be Genki, which is basically talking about how people can live happy, vital lives. And they travel to hospitals, they travel doing workshops all over Japan, and they built this incredibly beautiful, incredibly small and simple traveling home that lets them facilitate their work out of it. So they can live on the road, but do so in comfort with a business that doesn't necessarily always pay a tremendous amount of money, but it gives them a comfortable lifestyle traveling while they grow their business and do their positive work in the world. This one is another one which really interests me, resilience. Again, I don't think I have to convince anyone in BC that we kind of live in a changing climate, right? It was really, really scary to me where I saw, at one point in time, we were here in North America, and the place was on fire from, it was Southern California, right up the way into the Northern Territories, right? That's terrifying. I remember one weekend sitting in Vancouver and watching the news, and that you were talking about how there were 150 forest fires that started within a 24-hour period. That's mind-blowing, right? And with each and every one of those forest fires comes devastating real-life consequences. I don't need to tell you about this, right? It comes with loss of human life, loss of animal life, loss of homes. It is absolutely devastating to people. And one of the interesting things that I've seen about the tiny house movement is the way that in the face of changing climate, in the face of natural disasters, it's giving people a little bit of resilience. This is Tom. So Tom lives in King Lake, which is in Victoria in Australia. And the property where he lives had been completely devastated in one of Australia's worst forest fires. They call it the Black Saturday Fire. And when he was building his tiny house on wheels, he decided he wanted it to become as resilient as possible. He wanted to try to work on each and every aspect to pioneer new fire resilient techniques to give his house the best shot possible, that if it were again in a forest fire, it would have the best chance possible to survive, right? So if you are in an area here in BC or anywhere that is likely to be affected by forest fires, this is a really good video to check out, because he dives right the way into how to help make these homes more resistant. It's kind of an interesting one, right? I was talking to friends in Ojai, a builder called Ryan, and he lives in a tiny house, and he barely managed to get his tiny house on wheels out just in time before the fires rolled in. So that's another real benefit. Sometimes you can't get out. Sometimes you just have to go, and even if it's a tiny house on wheels, you just got to leave it. He ended up actually building a smaller tiny house on wheels so that it was easier to transport, so that next time the fires come through, it's a weird thing, right? Next time the fires come through, we're just expecting it now. But so that next time the fires come through, he'd be able to get out faster. But he was saying, places like Ojai, they're super gentrified, kind of like Vancouver, where councils just don't want to talk about tiny houses on wheels just yet. It's in the too hard basket. Let's let other places legalize it, and then we'll eventually begrudgingly do it when the social pressure becomes too much. But he was saying that all of a sudden, the fires are coming, and all of a sudden the highways are filled with tiny houses. They're all just coming out of people's backyards, all that are totally flying under the radar. All of a sudden, like the local Bass Pro parking lot is just filled with tiny homes. Walmart is packed with them. So again, I think it's a sad story, because he moved his tiny house off of the lot, and the parking space was destroyed by fire. The homeowners who were renting him the parking spot, they lost their home in the fire. But I think it's something that he managed to get out. So, forest fires, though, they're only one aspect of resilience. This is Paul. We had a really terrible earthquake in New Zealand, one in 2010 and again in 2011. More recently as well, we've had more severe earthquakes in Kaikoura. And it's scary. Really, really frightening. I think you guys are in an earthquake zone here as well, right? Yeah. So this was really interesting, because a few things happened. Firstly, we saw an explosion of people building tiny houses. Why? Because if you've ever been in an earthquake, if you've watched big buildings crumble down around you, then your concept of security starts to change. And all of a sudden, a small, simple shelter, which is already resilient to movement. I don't know if you know this, but a tiny house on wheels, to engineer one of these to be a movable structure, they have to be engineered to simultaneously be able to cope with a Category 3 cyclone and a magnitude 8 earthquake, magnitude 8 earthquake. That's how much stress and pressure is put on these things when they're on the road, right? It's incredible. So there were a lot of people for whom the large family home didn't seem all that secure. We also watched as insurance companies failed to pay out on the damage done to homes. There are people in New Zealand who 10 years later almost are still waiting on EQC payouts for their home, right? So when you watch people around you lose everything in one big natural disaster and not have the support to help rebuild, your concept around security starts to change. And all of a sudden, a small, simple shelter that's debt-free, that's resistant to earthquakes, and that is self-contained and self-reliant starts to look really appealing. That starts to look more secure than a conventional 4-bedroom family home. So Paul really dived into this, and he looked at all of the earthquake stress testing, and he worked on designing a tiny home that took that earthquake resilience to the absolute maximum potential to make sure that his clients, when he designs his tiny houses in Christchurch, can have utmost peace of mind that in the event of future earthquakes, they're going to be well looked after. It also had a couple of other really interesting side effects. One of those was, with the explosion of tiny house building, part of what was driving it was the availability of resources. With all of the earthquake-demolished homes, there was an abundance of timber, there was abundance of windows and all of these things that were coming out of demolished homes that people could get really cheap to be able to build their own tiny homes on wheels. It also means that council had to change the way they looked at composting toilets. I tell you what, if your sewer systems are busted up from an earthquake and you haven't been able to flush your toilet in a month, if you've got a composting toilet, you are the most popular person on your street. Water mains were down. Power was down. So some of these people who were in these small self-sufficient homes, they were really the only people who were capable of going about business as usual. So some interesting side effects of that as well. And then there's me. My kind of resilience was completely different. I wasn't running from forest fires. I wasn't affected by massive earthquakes. I was just somebody that was kind of struggling in the world. I was trying to get ahead. I was living in a city that was really expensive, in a generation that I feel had been a little bit forgotten about, where it was just naturally expected that I would be a renter until I died. I was somebody who felt like I had something to offer the world. I felt like life was a gift that shouldn't be wasted, and I felt like I should be able to create art, and I felt like I should be able to do something in the world that inspired me. And I found the ability to do that when I escaped the normal paradigm and decided to build a tiny house on wheels. So, questions? Thank you. Now, thank you. So with questions, I can take questions on all topics. It doesn't just have to be on what we were talking about today. I think there's going to be a microphone going around as well. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming out to the show today. But yeah, stick around. I'll take as many questions as I can before they kick me off the stage.
Check, check. Yes, questions. Come on.
Right,
You got
over
it.
here.
Right over here. Oh, where did you point to? There? There?
Right here, right here, right here.
All right. Bad questioner. There you are. There we go.
Where did you park your first tiny home?
Cool. The question is,
did you have to pay rent or anything to
Yeah.
the people?
Yeah, so the question is about, oh, you can hear it, right? Good, good. I'm learning. Thank you. So rent in tiny homes and parking spaces, this is a really big thing that freaks a lot of people out, right? If I build a tiny house, where am I going to park it? And it was a really interesting journey for me because I did my build very publicly. So because I did it publicly, I was really blown away at the offers that came my way. Originally, I didn't want it to be something that stopped me. I didn't want to make the fact that I didn't have a parking spot available to me something that prevented me from starting the journey. I remember I have really supportive parents. Right? But when I told my mom, I said, Mom, I've made this decision. I'm going to keep being an actor and I'm going to build a tiny house on wheels. And the very first thing she said to me was, you're not parking it here. So I looked into, I just started the build process. And because it was public, I started getting offers. People started talking to me. And I realized the huge array of reasons why tiny houses are not only good for tiny house dwellers, but they're also really good for landowners, okay? So here's a few of those reasons. Firstly, if you are somebody who is tremendously overburdened with mortgage, right? The idea of being able to give up a part of your driveway or to give up a part of your backyard to have an extra $100 in your pocket each and every week, that's a pretty big deal, right? So I got a lot of offers from people who were in that situation. If you're willing to go a little bit further outside of town, it was also the lifestylers. People who get into this sort of lifestyle block life quickly realize that self-sufficiency, the dream of self-sufficiency, is a lot of hard work, right? And so a lot of people who have lifestyle properties are struggling to maintain those properties, and they love the idea of being able to open up a little bit of land to somebody that can park in exchange for helping out on the land. I also got unexpected requests. Things like elderly people who wanted me parked up in their backyard or in their driveway just so that they had someone around, you know? So I really started to realize that the tiny house movement wasn't just about the people living in tiny homes, that there's a lot of place for these homes in society. And, you know, we're already seeing ADUs as a thing here in this region, right? Like we've toured a couple of laneway homes. The reason that I prefer tiny houses to laneway homes is because laneway homes are owned by the landowners, right? It's an additional income source for them, right? Whereas if we legalize tiny houses for those landowners, firstly, they don't have to put in the capital investment and overburden themselves yet again of building and adding onto their home. It also allows them to get a little bit of more modest rent each and every week for the parking space, but it still allows the person parking on that land to have ownership of their own home. So I think it ultimately, it stops one person from getting super fat off the investment, but it creates a little bit more fair share, which I think is a really good model. So, and it's not a far stretch, right? Because if laneways are legal, we can legalize tiny houses in that same category, right? Yes. Who's next? The maze of getting to the speaker.
Right. So coming from the U.S., where home ownership is a big part of your asset base, and so when you want to retire, you sell that and you're able to live off that investment income. And in the U.S. as well, when you're looking at $1,000 to $2,000 per month for health insurance after you retire, that's what the people that I've known who have retired they've had to sell that because it's an appreciating asset where you have the tiny homes, which are a depreciating asset. Also, being a mom with children and pets and everything else, just the concept of living, especially in the Northwest, where the winter can be very dark and rainy and moldy and on and on. Byron Bay, awesome, but it's definitely not that kind of environment here. So to be able to survive through a winter, I would just wonder how you would get. I don't know how people would get through.
Right. Okay. Definitely two questions there. I'm going to answer the second one first, which is about surviving through the winter and all of that sort of thing. Good design. Firstly, what I would say is that tiny house living is not for everyone, right? If I had 5 kids, I can't honestly tell you I'd want to live in a tiny house, right? So there are people who are going to be drawn to this kind of living, and there are people for whom it's just not going to work. Like, I can't imagine being a hoarder living in a tiny house. That's not going to be fun, right? So I think that's the first thing, that we have to accept that I'm never going to say that tiny house living is a blanket solution for everyone, because it's not. But there are definitely people who resonate with that lifestyle and for whom it's going to work. In terms of the asset of home ownership, that's kind of a more complicated question, right? So I guess what's interesting to us is that we've lived in a period of time where land has always been an appreciating asset, and I don't know to what degree that's going to be true in the future, right? And I'm really throwing it out there, and I know there's going to be economists who super disagree with me about this, but I just don't know that the future is certain. I mean, certainly we've seen in Australia the real estate market, we talk about it as a bubble, and I know that Vancouver as well has been hugely invested by foreign investment and things like that, and it takes simple changes in regulation to change the housing market and to create massive fluctuations. Australia, we've already seen a 20% dip in the market, right? So that means the people who bought in Sydney at $1 million, they've already lost $200,000 in the space of a year, right? So, and yeah, sure, we can look at trends over time as blips in a generally appreciating curve, but I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know what the future is going to be like when I retire. So that's one thing. And also, I would say that if you are in that situation, for me, part of my plan to resilience is stepping stones, right? Doing things in incremental steps. I don't see it being worthwhile, me going out and buying a regular home for $1 million in Auckland and paying the banks twice, sometimes 3 times the value of that home in interest over the course of the time that it takes me to pay it back as a good investment in my future. I really like the idea of having my tiny house, taking the money that I would be spending on rent, using it to save up a bit of land that I can buy debt-free, parking my tiny house on it, so on and so forth, so that I can do things in stages and steps to get to a point where I have an asset, where I have resilience and security that I haven't had to pay banks in triplicate for. Does that make sense? So, I'm not an economist. To me, it makes sense, though. And I think that, again, there are people who are in different situations where, purchasing a major asset like a home isn't as big a deal. I'm unfortunately not in that category. And so I think for me, this is something that resonated and that felt like a really good, solid, secure investment in my future. Yeah. Yes?
I watch your program all the time on YouTube.
Thank you.
I'm the youngest of 5 kids, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment up until I was 9. I'm used to small spaces. We had a farm just out here in Abbotsford for 100 years, and we were only allowed 1 dwelling on the property. And that's what I think is part of the problem right now. The movement is it's happening very slowly. Our farm sold, and I have some money that I can use to put forth for maybe a tiny house, or if I could get the land. But what I'm finding in terms of looking for land to park a tiny house on is there are so many zoning restrictions in having a home on wheels, an RV-styled home, unless it's utilized for recreational use. And I did look at a place up in the Okanagan in Peachland, but they had a ruling that you could stay in it for 30 days, less a day. And this is part of the problem. And I know that if we were given the opportunity to have tinies on properties, I would consider living in one. If it came with a house, I would rent the house out as an equitable way for me to live like you do.
Yeah, that's a big part of this, right? If you're standing in this room right now, or sitting, you are right at the beginning of a grassroots movement that's on the verge of exploding, right? But democracy is not a spectator sport. You've heard this before, right? And this is why one of the core and driving forces behind the tiny house movement is civil disobedience. No government, no council, no regulatory authority has the right to tell people that they can't have small, simple, affordable shelters when they have thousands of their citizens sleeping rough on the streets at night.
Woo!
Right? Any rights that we have, at some point in time, we had to fight for them. And we're seeing this happen now in the tiny house movement. People are coming together, people are mobilizing, people are creating local organizations that are working together with council to work things out. And council members are human beings too, right? They get this. You know, I've had quite a few occasions where I get an email and I see it's from a council email address and I'm like, shit. And then it's, hey, Bryce, I watch your show, I work for this council, and I'm really keen to build a tiny house. Can you tell me more about them? So, you know, many of the people that sit in council positions as well, they're struggling like many of us are. So getting together, organizing, talking with councils, being part of this grassroots movement and getting politically involved in changing regulation, that's something that we are all a part of right now. And you see the effects of this happening, right? You see groups in California, for example, that petitioned, and eventually there was the Fresno Code, which legalized tiny houses as accessory dwelling units in Fresno, California. That legislation, thanks to groups like the American Tiny House Association and the Latch Collective in Los Angeles petitioning local government, is what is leading to the eventual, it looks like tiny houses as accessory dwelling units are about to be legalized in Los Angeles. Now, when a major city like that makes a change, it becomes very, very hard for other major cities to say that doesn't apply to here, we can't do that, right? You've got groups that are hardworking here in the Vancouver area as well. You've got places like Maple Ridge that I hear are very close to legalizing tiny homes as accessory dwelling units. And this is all happening because people like you are coming together and they're making it happen. And events like this are such a huge part of it. Because if you're looking for the best resource for tiny homes, it's not out there, it's right here. You're sitting in a room, there were thousands of people here today who are all passionate about the very same thing that you are, about the very same future that you are. So use this as an opportunity, talk to one another, network, connect, organize, because together you're powerful. So that's what I would say to that.
Great talk. Thanks, Bryce.
Thank you so much.
So on that same topic around community, a lot of these images or a lot of these groups that you're talking to, sorry, not groups, they're individuals. And it brings up that question around community. You had talked about how, you know, indigenous tribes and how people have lived in small, you know, homes for so long. They've also typically lived in community in those homes and being able to, you know, share resources. I'm curious to know, and we've just addressed and kind of scratched that surface around zoning and codes and that kind of thing, but where are you seeing people who are finding ways around the rules or breaking those rules to become more community and creating this kind of movement?
Yeah, so a lot of it is kind of happening underground. So, you know, obviously in rural areas where people can't see what you're doing, it helps. So, you know, quite often when we're out in farming communities, you know, you can go to a field that's beautifully covered behind a lot of trees and see a lot of tiny houses parked back there and that sort of thing. It's going on. We're seeing it with a lot of sustainable communities, eco-villages, that sort of thing. One of the things that we've seen in New Zealand is eco-villages that have been working together with council to start adding tiny houses to the eco-village as well. So maybe they've got a field which is being underutilized and they're looking at creating more housing options for the community, and so they're including tiny houses in that. There are definitely options like that right the way through to cities like Portland, where I think now that tiny houses are legal as accessory dwelling units, you're seeing groups of people with tiny homes coming together, purchasing real estate, and having the main house as like a shared communal resource, and then all parking their tiny houses in the backyard sort of thing. So there's a lot of things like that that are happening, and I think that this is something which is really important because human beings, we are communal creatures, right? Like, we're tribal. We're designed to be around other people. We're designed to have basic human interaction. And so much of our society and the way that we're encouraged to live right now, it's all about building bigger and bigger fences, you know, and bigger homes, bigger fences, and we end up building ourselves into our homes and isolating ourselves from our community. And I think one of the beautiful things about living in a tiny house is that it's tiny. You're encouraged to get out of it sometimes, right? You're likely to spend more time in your local coffee shop. You're likely to spend more time outside interacting and actually using communal resources. And there's something really beautiful about that building of community. My street where I grew up, I remember I was in my teens. I was living at home, and there was a duck that flew into a power line. Boom! Big explosion, right? And all of the street went dark. All the power on the street was cut off. And people are like, what the heck was that explosion? They all come out of their homes, right? And they're all coming out with drinks and cups of coffee, glasses of wine. Some are in their bathrobes, like trying to figure out what's going on in the streets. Neighbors met each other for the first time, right? There was turned into this kind of street party as people connected, and people who had been living next to each other for 10 years finally connected with one another. We're not meant to live in isolation. And the concept of building community into the new housing models that we're working towards is so important. We spent time in Japan talking with architects about the redesign of Tokyo. And Tokyo is a really interesting scenario because they have really pioneered so much in terms of small space design, and they've been living in small spaces, and in many cases in a community which is quite socially isolating. A lot of people in big cities like Tokyo, they live in small spaces, they work in small cubicles, they drink in small bars when they're in small little cubicles alone, right? And we're seeing rates of suicide and depression on the increase. So people that are redesigning Tokyo now, they're not just looking at how to effectively use the space in terms of spatial design, they're looking at how to effectively reintegrate people so that they're connected with one another again. In terms of shared spaces, they're asking questions like, well, how do we create, instead of a little individual kitchenette, how do we create a kitchen unit where 10 adults can all comfortably cook their own meals individually, but in the same space with one another? They're asking a different set of questions after pushing the boundaries of what is really working. Because human psychology is something that we don't really think about enough when we're designing our homes and our cities. We've stopped designing our homes to face the street because instead we're designing our garages to go right onto the road so that we can drive right into our homes and don't have to talk to our neighbors, right? We've designed everything that there's no real reason to walk to anywhere. In fact, most of the time you can't walk to your local shops. You have to walk or get in your car and drive to the local community shopping center, which is maybe 15 minutes away, and where you're not really talking to your neighbors, you're talking to a whole bunch of people who also live maybe half an hour away, right? We're not thinking about human need in so much of the aspects of development of these homes. We're mostly thinking about profit. So within the tiny house movement, as this movement grows, we really get to think about things like community. We really get to think about pushing the boundaries of how we can create housing that makes people happy again. Yeah. Yes.
Hi there. First, I want to say I came from Toronto, so hi from Toronto.
Hi. Thank you for coming all this way.
Thank you.
And she just flew in.
I did.
No way. That's so cool.
That's my carry-on. Anyway, so I hate to
Traveling
contradict...
light, I like that.
Thank you. I hate to contradict your driving to the shopping center analogy,
right.
But how do you go about having a postal address for when you're getting things shipped to you when you live in a tiny home?
I mean, it totally depends on what you're doing and sort of how you're living, right? Like if you have a tiny home that's parked at a residential address, you just use the residential address. When you're traveling around, like we spend a lot of time on the road, and what we'll try to do is we'll sort of have a basic idea, like maybe I know that in 2 months' time, I'm going to be seeing my auntie in Missouri. So if I need stuff picked up, I'll ship it to there and I'll pick it up when I need it. You know, other than that, I mean, you can have stuff shipped to local post office. You can have stuff shipped to hotels. You can have it shipped to a corner store if you want. Like, it's really pretty easy. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Yes, you there.
You've showcased a lot of successes, and I'm wondering if you have any mistakes that people could learn from that you know about. And I also just want to take the opportunity to network and say I'm with a group that's trying to form a tiny home community in the Maple Ridge Mission area. So I have brochures if anyone wants to come.
Fantastic. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of stories where tiny house living hasn't worked out for people. When I see most people getting out of tiny house living, the most common reason for that is because their life circumstances have changed somehow. Most of the time that involves them falling pregnant, right? Having kids and understandably not necessarily wanting to be in a tiny house with a screaming little baby. But I think that and I'm going to be talking about this in way more detail tomorrow in the design talk. The biggest thing that trips people up in small space design is kind of like what I touched on before. It's when you design your home for an idealistic version of yourself who doesn't really exist, right? If you're somebody who spends 10 hours a day watching Netflix and you don't put in a comfortable couch and TV in your home, you're not going to be happy, right? So I think the most times that I've seen people for whom tiny house living hasn't worked out, it's to do with just that. They haven't been honest with themselves about their needs. They haven't designed their home to accommodate them. Cool. Any more questions? Thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with you today. Hopefully we're going to see you again tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you. Super, super exciting day. There's going to be lots more great speakers. I'm going to be talking about principles of small space design. There's lots going on at the build stage as well. I cannot wait to see how far they get on that tiny house on wheels. So thanks, and hopefully I'll see you again tomorrow.